This episode of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Re-Analog, chronicling the small but meaningful fluctuations in signal lost in digital life at re-analog.com. Season 3 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Carl Haley and Daniel Murphy. My girlfriend, after this, I would take her to the Mercado Medellín here in Mexico City. What kind of eating experience does a place like that represent to you? What's important? What's unique or sort of culinarily meaningful about a vast market like that?
Well, what's culinarily meaningful is that the raw ingredients are all around you. You're in a market. That particular market is known to be a good market, high quality market. It's known for its seafood. So there are several fish stands in the market. It's a clean market, and a lot of people go there to eat lunch, to eat a special meal on weekends, specifically seafood. So to me, eating in a market where you can see sides of beef, whole fish, big cases of vegetables going by is a delightful experience anywhere. Some people might be turned off by that, not me. I think that I feel safer eating food where I see the raw ingredients. I don't think they're going to serve you something old, right? Because right next door to them they're selling fish, meat, produce, etc.
It's Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, sitting down here in Colonia, Roma, in Mexico City today with Nicholas Gilman, who is an artist as well as a writer on Mexico City's food. He does the blog Good Food in Mexico City, and is the author of the book Good Food in Mexico City, Food Stalls, Fondas, and Fine Dining. Now, you were not brought here by food, right? It was the art that brought you to Mexico City.
It was the art that brought me to Mexico City. I grew up with Mexican art and culture all around me. My parents lived in Mexico in the 40s and 50s, which I would call the golden age of culture in Mexico. They were right here in Mexico City. And I always knew about the Mexican artists. I was in high school and university. I was studying painting. And I knew about Diego Rivera, and I knew about Frida Kahlo before she became, before Frida Mania hit the world. And I came down here, the very first time I came down here while I was still in school by myself to study the murals. And it was very difficult. There were no books, there were no postcards, there were no reproductions. I had to take my own photos, and I did a school paper on the murals, but I was always captivated by the food and had this idea in my mind, even from an earlier age, about eating and trying and experiencing authentic food of whatever culture I was in. And I think that comes from growing up in Manhattan, in the Italian neighborhood. There were fewer ethnicities, at least visible ethnicities at that time. But I grew up with Italians all around me. We knew about Italian food. We knew about Chinese food to a degree. Certainly not what we know now or what we knew later. Regional variations. We knew very little about Mexican food. But I remember at that time, the first thing I wanted to try when I came here were tortillas that were fresh from a tortilleria. I had this fixed idea in my mind, and I remember I was 18 years old, I walked into a tortilleria and asked them if they would sell me one tortilla. And of course they laughed and just gave me a tortilla. I had no idea that people buy them by the kilo. So I always had that idea that you have to experience the word authentic. I hate that word, but that's the word that comes to mind. That I wanted to eat the real food, and of course I had been warned not to eat street food, not to do this and that. But and I, for the most part, didn't. But at the end of that very first trip, I just let all loose, and I went into taquerias and places on the street and ate, and I didn't get sick. So there you go.
Mexico City is a place of so many don'ts. Don't eat the street food, don't drink the water, don't go to that neighborhood or that neighborhood or that neighborhood. And often it's Mexicans saying it to a visitor. Why does this continue to be a vast region with so many warnings? Do you know what I mean? We have these ideas about what we shouldn't do in Mexico City.
Well, I think any city has those warnings. I think we used to say things like that to visitors to New York. Perhaps still do, but don't walk in Central Park at night. Don't go here, don't go there. I think that there's some truth. There's always some truth to these warnings. This is a big city. There is crime here. There are places, if you don't know what you're doing, you shouldn't do. I tell visitors to use the taxis that you call, not necessarily to take them on the street, but that particular phenomena of people getting robbed in taxis has kind of is changing. It doesn't happen as much anymore, but that's just one example. I promote street food. People say, don't eat food on the street, and Mexicans will tell you that, but I don't believe in making that a fixed rule, because street food isn't just one thing. Not all stands are the same. Stands are little micro restaurants, and each one is different. And there's a lot more conscientiousness nowadays about cleanliness, especially since the big flu scare of a few years ago that happened around the world. I think people are really more careful about not handling the money and washing their hands and all that kind of stuff. And I think sanitation has definitely improved in the last 15 or 20 years that I've been here.
I would imagine at this point, even if you were ever getting sick from the food, you're not anymore. Here, you join the ecosystem, right?
Right. I'm not. I went to India recently, and I also didn't get sick, so there you go. But I think, to get back to your original question, this is a huge city, and it's people worry about visitors to any huge city. People are not sure that you know what you're doing if you're coming from one city to another, and visitors to a place tend to let down their guard. I have gotten robbed in other places, but not here, because here I keep up my guard. Of course, as we were talking about before, I grew up in New York, and I experienced the New York of the 1970s and 80s, and if you survive that, you can survive anything.
Right. You're good as far as Mexico City goes, but tell me about your impressions of the city you said it was 1980 when you were first here, studying the murals?
Around then, yeah.
Okay, yeah. What, other than the one tortilla, getting laughed at about that and all the work with the murals, what were your impressions of this place when you first started exploring and were able to see what Mexico City exactly was?
It seemed very much more run down. I think New York did too. I think Rome did. It reminded me of Rome, because I had been to Rome shortly before, in the sense that the infrastructure seemed very run down, very funky. Public transportation was old and decrepit. And like Rome, you saw ancient or seemingly ancient ruins and buildings and ruins. This was before the big earthquake of 1985, which changed a lot of things here. I remember thinking it was a real third world city. And then when I came back, I didn't come back until the late 80s, shortly after the earthquake. So I saw the devastation of the earthquake. But after that, the infrastructure started to slowly improve. Public transportation started improving, roads and streets, and that has escalated very recently, last 5 or 6 years, with the last mayor, Ebrard. As you know, we now have the bicycle system and all kinds of very, very progressive things. It's improved in many progressive social ways. It's become a city that's much easier to live in. The air is much better. There's much less contamination in the air than there was 10 years ago.
Right, you experienced firsthand what it was like at its worst, right?
It was terrible. I wouldn't have lived here full time back then, 15 years ago. There were days when you couldn't see to the end of the street, and that doesn't happen anymore. It's really changed because of all the government initiatives to get cars off the street and the improvement of public transportation. And I think they've also clamped down on industrial pollution, which is a big factor, the way they have in other cities like LA. So it's really improved. It's just become a really pleasant city to live in. I would say more than pleasant isn't a good word. It's become a fabulous city to live in if you have enough money. Not if you're poor, but even if you're middle class. It reminds me in some ways of the New York that I used to know, because you can come here and you can open a small business, you can open a small restaurant or a store or a business. There are opportunities here for people who have skills and ideas, and people are doing that. I think that's much harder to do in, say, New York now, because in New York now you need a lot of money. And you see TV programs like Girls, which show people who are struggling and trying to do that, but they can't.
Right. It seems like the commercial opportunities of Mexico City are very clearly represented by the food, by the proliferation of street stalls and trendy restaurants and everything in between. I mean, is that emblematic of that kind of the opportunity Mexico City provides? How many kinds of even just food businesses you see pop up?
Absolutely. There are some new restaurants opening up. One example is a place called Maximo Bistro. The chef is young. He's in his early 30s. He worked at a couple of well-known restaurants, including Le Bernardin in New York. And he came back here with his wife on a shoestring, opened up a small corner restaurant in the Colonia Roma, near where we're sitting right now, that is absolutely exquisite. It's not expensive. It's not exactly Mexican food. It's kind of European bistro food, but with a Mexican touch, and he uses local ingredients and organic, local, et cetera, et cetera. And it is such a wild, smashing success after a year that you can't even get a table there anymore. It's become an incredible business, but this chef Eduardo has such integrity that he remains behind his stove. He has not become a star chef. He has not opened a branch. He hasn't expanded other than for a few tables on the street. His wife, who was a yoga teacher, is still the hostess when you come in, and they're just really rocking. And that's an example of somebody who, I'm sure they didn't have a lot of money. They did not get a $500,000 to open this corner place. They just found a storefront in a neighborhood that was not particularly frequented by anybody, any upper middle class people. And now there are limousines pulling up to this place.
Oh my God.
That's an example of a food success. There are also many little places, small bars, restaurants. There's a fish tacos place around the corner. The guy went to the Culinary Institute in America, but came back to Mexico City and opened a fish taco place, which is not something that you find in Mexico City, because it's something that's from the coast, from Baja California. A lot of people are doing that. Art galleries, shops, boutiques, small businesses that you can do the way people were doing it in New York in the 70s and 80s, and going down to the Lower East Side or the East Village and renting a cheap storefront and opening up a business. You can't do that in New York anymore. You can't do that in an LA or Paris or London anymore, but you can do that here. And so for that kind of person, for people who think about culture, and I include food in culture, there are possibilities. It's also very difficult. There's little government funding for culture here. There's little private funding for culture, because there's not a tradition in Latin America for charity to cultural institutions. So I think it's very difficult to, for example, open a theater.
I see.
I think
I haven't heard of many of those here. That's true.
No, there are a lot of small theaters here. There actually is a sort of healthy theater.
Well, that's good to hear.
Culture. Yeah, my father was a theater critic, so I'm somewhat in tune to that. But as far as cutting edge art in theater, I don't know. I don't know. There's a lot of popular theater. It's still quite vibrant, and then we get these big shows like they're doing Mary Poppins, that kind of theater. But there are also a lot of small theaters because you can operate things on a budget. You can operate shops, restaurants, galleries, theaters, you name it, on a shoestring. Labor is cheap. Rents are in many areas still cheap. And there's a lot of space.
When did you know you were going to put down roots in Mexico City? From the time visiting till the time you buying property here, getting citizenship. When was the point when you realized, yes, this is going to be the place for me?
There was a point when I wasn't sure. It's very hard when you're from New York to let go of New York.
Oh, yes.
To cut the umbilical cord of New York. I grew up thinking that New York was the center of the world. I was one of those people.
It's unavoidable to some extent, right, if you grow up there.
And especially in terms of the U.S., there was basically very little between New York and L.A. Perhaps Chicago existed to me, but and Europe, of course. But I never thought of really living full-time. It became apparent at some point. It just became apparent that I was happier here. It was a very personal, inward-looking moment when I went back to New York, and I still had a studio in Soho, on the edge of Soho and Tribeca, and I looked out the window one day and I said, "What the hell am I doing here?" I said to myself, "I'm happy there. I'm not happy here. What's the point?"
You were dividing your time, and then you didn't want to get back on that flight to JFK one of those times, right?
Exactly. I would get back on that flight to JFK and get there, and the next morning be on the subway going downtown, and it would be raining, and it would be cold, and everybody would look miserable and pale. And I just didn't. I realized that it was possible, and it was a little more difficult then because communications were more difficult. We didn't have the internet yet. That kind of technology, which is here, came more slowly. I'm talking about 10, 15 years ago. So you had the internet there, but we didn't have it here. Or if we did, nobody had it. I certainly didn't.
Right. There's a certain kind of famous New York masochism. I think of those faces you describe on the subway. They're miserable, but they're in New York and they ain't going nowhere else. They hate the place, but it's the greatest place. Mexico City's New York's not a capital, but it's the cultural capital. Mexico City is the capital. It's the big city where people come. Is there a similar masochism among Mexicans here? Like, this city, but, nowhere else for me?
No, I don't think so. Mexico City is the center. It's a little like Paris is to France in that it's the cultural and economic and political capital of the country. Monterrey is the second city in terms of technology, but and money. But I think that for people, at least in the arts and in culture, it's not. You don't have to suffer so much. Look at the weather. There's a blue, sunny sky, and it's February.
How can there be masochism with less pain? Yes.
Right. There's not as much pain, and I'm not talking about the millions who do not have a happy life here, who have to work. There are still thousands of people arriving in the city every day from the country because they don't have work, because they can't manage to survive on a small farm or a piece of land, and that's not who I'm talking about. But people that I work with and know are very happy to live here, and we thank God every day. We go out the door and see the sunny blue sky, and we just go like, why would I want to live anywhere else? Why would I want to live in Paris or London or New York? Because when I can have this, a better quality of life.
Tell me about joining the visual art ecosystem here, I guess I'll say. You are a realist painter. Tell me what is this environment conducive to the kind of visual art you do in any particular way, or is it just good to do art in this type of place?
Well, I should make it clear, I'm not really painting anymore. I've basically switched careers. I am writing now. I consider myself a food writer, a journalist, and I pretty much dedicate myself full-time to writing.
Were you leading parallel careers for a while there, trying to do both at once?
For a while, but I mostly gave up painting. And to answer your first question, I did not find it easy to get into the art scene such as it was. There were not very many galleries. There are a few more now. I never liked the career aspect of art. I grew up in it. My mother was a painter. When I came here, and I was doing more commercially oriented art. I was painting screens and murals and faux finishes and that kind of thing. So I had sort of forged a career for myself in order to be able to make money from my training in fine art. I didn't care that much about being on the cutting edge. I lived through the period of the East Village art scene of the 80s without participating in it.
Let that go on by without having to don't get caught up.
Exactly, as I say, I'm surrounded by people in the arts. My sister is a curator in New York, and I just didn't enjoy the career. I hated it, really. I hated it, and I found it very difficult to work. I had a few shows here, and then I got into food, and that was my other passion. I would say that was a stronger passion. I was always interested in food as a kid, and so that's when I got into writing and researching Mexican food, and I basically gave up. I moved into an apartment here. I didn't have a studio to work in, and I just took that as an excuse to stop. And I haven't gone back to it. Not that I won't, but I changed careers.
How was it that you realized you could take your interest in food and convert it into words and write about it? You know, there's a certain. I imagine you have to frame that task in a certain way that makes sense. It's not instinctive to write about food, is it? You've got to have a bit of a mental framework to say, here's what I'm going to pursue. Here's how I'm going to write about it. What was that for you?
Well, my father was a theater critic, and he was a quite well-known theater critic, and he wrote about theater, but he didn't write theater. And I once, when I was a teenager, had a conversation with him about that, because I said to my father, well, if you can write so well about theater or about literature, why can't you make it yourself? It didn't, and he said, well, that's kind of the problem. He said, I suffer from that. He said, I wanted to, but food is a little different. I did not want to be a chef. I cook. I love cooking. I study it, but I never wanted to be a professional chef. I worked in restaurants when I was younger, of course, and but I wanted to produce something that was lacking here. This is another aspect of being in this country. There are a lot of opportunities, and I saw an opportunity because there was no guide to food. There were no guidebooks, certainly not in English, and very few in Spanish either. There were the usual tourist guidebooks that had the usual places, and nobody had written about where to go. You came to Mexico and you want Mexican food. Where do you go? So I had been gathering all this information for years, and I had all this information.
Talking to people, through just wandering and exploring, through what way?
Talking to people, wandering, exploring, reading magazines and places and books and guides. A couple of guides came out here in Spanish, and so I had a good list of places, and I just thought, well, let's put this down. And I have a good education. I wasn't a writer. I didn't feel I took after my father in terms of writing, but I could write decently. And I basically just taught myself to write about food. And I read up on authors who I liked, people like Ruth Reichel and various journalists, and learned to do it. And I put together this book. And by that time, print on demand had come into being, and I bypassed the process of trying to find a publisher because I felt like this was going to be a very hard sell.
Really?
Because
even though there weren't guides?
Well, it wouldn't be a hard sell now, and in fact, later I did publish it in the regular way, but that was because Mexico City by that time had become a sort of a chic destination and known for eating. But when I first published my book, that was about 5-6 years ago, it wasn't, and so I had no help and no financial assistance, and I just did it myself, and a friend who's a designer helped me design it, and we did it. But then it caught on, and I won a Gourmand Prize, cookbook award, and I got known, and after that I started the blog. I wasn't even very aware of blogs and tuned into that world, but I started it to have a venue, and I started writing. I write freelance, but that's really how it came about, and there was nothing like it, and there still isn't, and now, as you know, Mexico City has become this food eating destination, and it's been travel and leisure and this and that, name it, as the top gourmet eating food destinations of the world, and as it should be and as it is.
What do people get wrong when they go eating in Mexico City? Are there common mistakes that people, just techniques for eating that don't apply here, or people approach the city in a way that isn't to their best eating advantage?
I think the thing that people get confused about most is the timing of food, when and the way people eat, because it's not the same as European or American protocol for eating. In other words, what I'm talking about are the hours when people eat certain things. For the most obvious example is the fact that Mexicans don't eat dinner. We don't have a tradition of dinner parties, dinner at 8, that kind of thing. Now that's changing, and Mexicans are starting to go out to dinner, I put that between quotation marks, in the way that they do in France and U.S. and everywhere else, as a thing to do. You see some of the fancy restaurants here that are full, but in general, the most Mexicans have a midday meal, and it's late, 2 to 4. You'll see restaurants still full at 5 and 6 o'clock, and many of those people will go back to their office and continue working until 8 or 9 o'clock, and that confuses people who are visitors, myself included. The first time I came here, I was always looking for places to go out to dinner, and a lot of places either were closed or closing. So they would officially be open till, say, 9 or 10, but you'd go and there'd be nobody there, and we'd ask ourselves, where is everybody? Why isn't everybody here? Because they weren't going out to dinner. Still to this day, most people I know do not have dinner parties. They will have what they call a cocktail, but that will start at 8 o'clock, and they'll usually provide light food, or perhaps even more than light food, and it will go till all hours. We also don't have the concept of cocktail party from 6 to 8. That doesn't exist. Putting an ending on on a social event is considered vulgar.
I see.
It's like asking people to leave, and they don't do it. And even art openings and things like that will just give a starting time. So that's what confuses people. And why can't I? And people don't eat seafood at night.
Right. It's only midday for mariscos, no?
So a very well-known, popular restaurant called Contramar.
Oh yeah, I like Contramar.
And everybody goes to Contramar. It's not open for dinner. They close at about 6. That's because it's a seafood restaurant, and that's how you do it. And I think that tradition comes from the idea that fish is not good at night. It doesn't keep. which is not true anymore because we have refrigeration.
21st century, sure, but still tradition.
Yeah, it's tradition, and that is true in South America, in Peru. All the famous cevicherias of Peru are lunchtime places. So I think that's something. But other than that, I don't think people make mistakes. I think most people are fearful about eating. For example, eating street food. You have to kind of read my book and follow the rules. If you don't know what you're doing, go to popular places. Go to places that look clean. Avoid certain kinds of things at certain times. So, for example, seafood that's out in the hot sun during the hot season. Maybe you want to stay away from that. Oil that looks greasy and dark and unclean. But I think that if you kind of follow rules, I've written about that and how to eat street food so that you are less likely to have problems with it. And other than that, it's, as I say, in every even middle of the road restaurant on up, they will serve safe water. They wash things carefully. They're clean. This was not true 20 or 30 years ago. When my parents were here in the 40s and 50s, there was no such thing as bottled water in Mexico. People used to boil their water, and restaurants didn't, and you got sick.
It really was don't drink the water in those days.
It really was. It is less so now. You could theoretically drink Mexico City's water. I think it's treated. It might not taste particularly good. I get bottled water in my house, but I brush my teeth with. It's not unsafe as it was once. It might be in certain rural areas, but it's not. Those things have changed. There's a great conscientiousness about sanitation here now. It's not perhaps up to the standards of Europe or U.S. or Asia, certain countries in Asia like Japan, but it is way ahead of what it was. We're pretty close to being a first world country now. I would call it like a second world country. But
it's hard not to think of it as. I mean, some elements of Mexico City you mentioned, like the bike programs, things like that, would be the envy of a lot of very developed cities I could think of. Especially in America, there are many ways in which Mexico City is more advanced than cities that are supposedly more developed. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think so.
Yes and no?
Well, yes, I don't know because I haven't lived in those other cities, really. I've certainly visited them. I mean, where Amsterdam has had things like this for years. It's new to Mexico City, and a lot of it is really due to the last mayor, Marcelo Ebrard. And he paid a lot of attention to making things green and making quality of life better. Because before that, many of the governments were slaves to the car culture, and we have a car culture, a sad car culture, a little bit like LA. People think they need to get in their cars to go to the supermarket, and they're trying to sort of steer people away from that. And the other unfortunate side of things is the class system here that is still very, very strong, and middle and upper middle class people tend not to use public transportation because of the fact that they just don't.
It's not that it's not really about inequality as of it, but that's just not what we do, referring to their own class.
Exactly. We have the metro system is one of the nicest in the world.
Yeah, I like it a lot.
It's certainly a lot nicer than New York. It isn't nearly as extensive, but it's clean, efficient, and
cool
cheap.
Icons as well that mark the stations.
Well, those icons are because some people are illiterate and need a visual icon to know what the stations are. But it's a great system. It's not extensive enough, of course, because it only I think it was inaugurated 40 years ago. But it's something that is new to people, and they're trying to kind of steer people away from their cars. So that's, of course, one of the big problems here is traffic, and it can be bad. It doesn't affect me because I don't work in an office, and I use a bicycle, and I tend to be able to avoid rush hour. But
right. That's like me in Los Angeles. I just tinker with my life in every possible way so that I don't have to drive a car. I'll go to any lengths because, the traffic, you know what I mean? You see it in Mexico City. It's like crossing the streets. You can cross very often because the traffic ain't going nowhere.
That's right. That's right. But and Mexicans get very impatient when there are cars. They're the nicest people in the world. There's so much grace in ordinary social interactions, and yet you put somebody in their car and they turn into a monster.
There's a sort of depersonalization that goes on with the cars and the people. It becomes a war of all against all. It's just machine versus man, right?
I think that's what it is. But I think it's also this class thing that comes out, and people will look down on people who decide to use a bicycle.
Really?
Yeah. Yeah.
Let's say you go to a new city, to a city you've never been to before. You want to go eating. You want to find the most interesting food experiences. What do your instincts tell you to do? Is it go to the poorer neighborhoods? Is it go to neighborhoods of various ethnicities? Where do you, if you know nothing else about a city but that there is food, where do you tend to, what's a good bet as far as where to turn your head?
Well, I always try to find out if there's a market. By market, I mean a popular market, or a covered market, or an outdoor market. And when you're in certain places, I went to Poland last year. I went to Krakow, and I didn't know if there would be such a thing as a market. And indeed there was, and it was absolutely fabulous. And it immediately gave me an insight into what the local food is. And a lot of it reminded me of old Jewish, food that I grew up with, interestingly. But that is an example. I always try to find markets. I love markets. Around the world, Asia, India, you name it, I find the market. I try to make that one of the first priorities of visiting a city. And that, I think, just seeing what people buy, even if there isn't food to actually eat in the market, you can see what people buy and get an insight into it. And it really depends, of course. I mean, if we're talking about Europe, it's different than if we're talking about, say, India or Southeast Asia, where you can find market food, street food, that kind of thing. You're not going to find that in Europe. You need to get recommendations. You need to have people who you trust tell you where to go.
It does seem like the tapping into the social knowledge is going to be a large part of eating wherever you are, especially here, especially in Mexico City. You want to, we have guides like yours now, but you want to talk to people, don't you, ultimately?
Absolutely. You want to talk to people. You want to ask people. Taxi drivers are a great source around the world. And I've tapped into taxi drivers in places like Cambodia, or in other towns and cities in Mexico. You say, where do you go? Where is the local food? And they will often take you. And that could be true in Italy. That could be true anywhere.
Right. There's a danger sometimes, though, not from taxi drivers, but asking locals. I show up as a foreigner. I ask a local, where's a good place to drink a coffee or to have a snack? And they point me to the most expensive place. That it's a place that I guess they can be proud of that exists, but it's not what I'm looking for. It's maybe a bit pricey, maybe a bit bland. You're familiar with this problem, I'm sure, right?
Oh, absolutely. You have to convince people that you really want the real thing, that they have. And very often people, when they understand that you want to eat their food, you don't want something that's special, that's prepared for tourists. You don't want a tourist trap. You don't want food that's been toned down or numbed down, which can happen here, can happen in say, Thailand. Very easy. They'll send you to some place that's, you wouldn't like the real food because, it's too spicy.
They'll send you someplace a half step from McDonald's.
Well, maybe not. Hopefully not that bad. But often when you really convince people that you want to eat local food, they will be flattered and they will tell you where they go. And I've had that. I've had that experience many places around the world. Where people, once they're convinced and once they understand what you're talking about, they may not send you to a market because that may not be where they eat themselves, but they may hopefully will send you to a place that is where local people go, where they're preparing real food for real people.
Right. I wonder, your Mexican friends and readers, do you have a sense of what they think about how they react to having somebody born elsewhere, even though you may now be effectively Mexican? You come from somewhere else, and you've done a lot of the food homework that maybe they themselves haven't done. Is there a sense of that, like that you bring an outsider's perspective, and that's useful even to Mexicans?
Yes, I once in a while get a comment or a reaction from somebody who has a chip on their shoulder about that,
really?
Who might resent a so-called foreigner, even though I am a Mexican citizen at this point, telling them. And Diana Kennedy, the queen of Mexican cooking, who is like the Julia Child to Mexican cooking. She's been writing and living here for 50 years. Was not recognized by the local culinary community until very recently. Her books were not translated into Spanish until the last few years, and she was resented by some. And I'm talking about the upper echelon, the chefs, the food writers here. They resented her. How could they resent somebody who spent most of her life in the field, interviewing women in small towns in Oaxaca and transcribing their recipes and teaching that to the rest of the world, teaching the rest of the world that Mexican cooking is more than just nachos and burritos. How could they resent a person like that? But they resented Julia Child too, I think, in France, or at least didn't recognize her. And she and Rick Bayless, for example, people, he's a sellout. He's not a sellout. He's teaching the English-speaking world about Mexican food and what it is and the extent of it, and what have a lot of these people here done. It's a very insular community here, the high-end chefs. So, but I think that's changing. I think those people are starting to recognize that fact and are proud of that fact. And I think now Diana Kennedy is recognized here, and her books are. Her last book about Oaxaca was published in Spanish before it was published in English.
Oh, that's the true mark of getting acceptance.
Absolutely, and So yes, to answer your question, yes, once in a while I get a little flack, but I just say, well, I do what I can do, and I think I'm now one of the liaisons to the English-speaking world, at least, about this city and about what's happening here in food.
And it's not even the flack I wonder about so much as there's a sense in which when I want to hear about America, I want to hear a foreigner talk about America. Do you know what I mean? Like, there must be a Mexican readership of yours who thinks I want to hear about my country's cuisine from someone who had to come and learn about it. That might be a little bit of a vague way to put it, but do you know what I mean?
Well, I think it often takes a foreigner to really see, or an outsider to see a culture, to really see what's going on, to understand it. I think that's always been true, and that's why we've been reading for English and American writers who wrote about Mexico, from D.H. Lawrence to people who've written about France, about India, about every outside culture. That's why we read those people, because they have a perspective. You have a perspective when you're not from it that somebody who's from it can't have. And there have been very few people who have written about other. I don't know where I'm going with this. Sorry, I have to kind of. Octavio Paz, for example, was the ambassador, the Mexican ambassador to India, and he wrote a very, very interesting book about his perspective on Indian culture. And it was one of the few, it's certainly the only one I've read about Indian culture written by, it's published in English. I suppose it was originally published in Spanish, but that is written by somebody who isn't American or English. And it was so interesting because he talked about some of the comparisons between Indian culture and food to Mexican culture. And many Indian people I know say that, even on people who visit here. Say, oh, so many things remind me of India. And so that was very interesting. So yes, it's always interesting to know what an outsider impressions are about a culture, and they will often be able to be more introspective about it.
What do you think is important for foreigners to know about the cuisines of Mexico? What do we usually not know that we really could benefit from knowing? Just basic facts about the nature of Mexican cuisine.
Well, that Mexican cuisine is regional, that there are regional specialties, that Mexican cuisine varies from area to area.
I've heard Mexican friends say if you haven't had mole in every single state of Mexico, you haven't really known Mexican food.
That there may not be mole per se in every single state, but there's certainly mole. There are variations of mole in several states, and that's true. And I think that, to start with, there are many people who don't know that there's more to it than what we would call a Tex-Mex, that there's not more to it than burritos, which aren't even found in this area of Mexico.
I've never seen a burrito here.
No, well, there actually are one or two places, but they're not the same as California burritos. And nachos, which was an American invention, and chimichangas, which doesn't exist at all.
But it's sort of an interesting side branch of the evolutionary food tree in and of itself. Even if it can often be fairly bland, it's kind of fascinating that it developed, isn't it?
That what developed?
This sort of Tex-Mex, chimichanga, burrito, the sort of American Mexican food. Like, it's a fascinating thing to observe, even if the stuff's better here.
Well, it's interesting because you also see that in Italian American food. The pizza that we know developed in the United States. A lot of Italian American dishes developed in the United States. Spaghetti and meatballs developed in the United States. Chinese American food. And I think we're starting to finally recognize that not all those things are necessarily bad if they're made well. I like to paraphrase Duke Ellington, who said that there are two kinds of music, good music and bad music. Well, there are two kinds of food, good food and bad food. But we're starting to recognize that those cuisines came up in America, and they aren't necessarily bad, but they often are bad. And they're certainly not it's not what goes on here. And most people outside of Mexico don't know that how rich the culture of culinary culture is here. It's one of the richest in the world.
Tell me what you've seen. This is always fascinating to me, about the ways that foreign cuisines have adapted to Mexico. You know, when you see a Japanese restaurant here, a Chinese restaurant. Before recording, I was talking about the Korean restaurant I was at the other night. When other cuisines come here, what happens to them?
Other cuisines aren't that popular here. There's been a recent sort of trend of inexpensive sushi chains where they've adapted to a small degree. They have sushi that has cream cheese in it, which I just think is awful, but people like it. They perhaps will adapt American fast food to Mexican tastes by offering spicy salsa, things like that. They have a phenomena of Mexican Chinese restaurants that have dishes that are very nominally Chinese. They're really not. They're not usually very good. It's not a cuisine that grew and developed. It's just kind of pseudo Chinese food, fried rice, gloppy, sweet and sour things. So I would say, in general, Mexicans until recently we're not that accepting and open to other kinds of cuisines. And I think you could say that for a lot of Europeans, too, with the exceptions of places like Paris and London, where there were always immigrants, and or at least in the 20th century. So that's the difference between people like me who grew up in New York, which was a multi-ethnic city, and we from day one, I experienced other kinds of food, and it was interesting to me. And most Mexicans aren't. They're expanding, and now there are ethnic restaurants, Spanish, French, Italian, Chinese, Japanese, Thai, etc., etc. But it's not like Paris, London, LA, New York, and we don't have large communities of foreign people. The biggest community of foreign people are Spaniards who came in the 20th century after the Spanish Civil War. I'm not talking about the descendants of the original Spaniards who came in the colonial era. And these people tend to bring their traditions of food from Spain. And so there are some excellent Spanish restaurants. And that's been going on before Spanish regional cooking became trendy around the world. But as I say, people aren't knowledgeable or as open to things like Thai food and Indian food that we may be, but that's changing too. But that's why Mexican cuisine itself has been so well preserved, and why people and I don't think foreign fast food chains are really that popular here. They're perceived as being expensive and not very good, and most people go and eat tacos on the street and fabulous quesadillas and all kinds of wonderful things that have not changed and have not been updated to the 21st century.
When you can pull up a stool on the street and pay 30 pesos and have something delicious, it's hard to rationalize going to the McDonald's or whatever else might be on the corner, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And you can go into a market and have a meal served in 3 or 4 courses, served by a woman who looks like your mother or grandmother, and it costs about $2 or $3 US, and it's good, and it's filling, and it's homemade by hand. What's there not to like? You know?
What are you exploring right now in Mexican cuisine? I mean, there's so much you have explored, but it seems like there's always some new corner of Mexico City where someone's making something that goes back a long time. I mean, is that true? Is there always something new to discover, or have you kind of covered it?
Well, there's this city is enormous. There are supposedly 35 or 36,000 registered restaurants, eating joints, and that's the registered ones. There's always something new to discover. Old places that have been here for 50 years, I'm still discovering them. There's no way I could ever try or discover all of them. But of course, I'm also looking for to discover new small restaurants, new ethnic restaurants. Mm-hmm. For people who live here, like me, this is an international city. And we have international culture, and there's nothing wrong with that. So I'm very happy to try the latest Spanish or Italian restaurant. And I love discovering these new, even if they're trendy hipster spots, there's some really interesting new places popping up, like mushrooms. And it's hard to keep up with it.
Though it may not have happened yet, do you foresee in the future these foreign cuisines coming in and being hybridized with or influenced by Mexican cuisine in a way that's interesting and not just kind of the cream cheese sushi?
I think that's already happening.
Oh, yeah.
I think that any good chef is going to come to a place and take advantage of what's there. I think it would be pretty hard unless you're in a place like Dubai, which has nothing indigenous. I may be wrong, but I haven't been there. But I think Italian chefs and Spanish chefs go to the market and they see what's here, and many chefs will go a step further than that and utilize Mexican ingredients, Mexican techniques, Mexican flavors in their food, and that's absolutely to be expected. One of the finest Japanese restaurants that I went to, that's frequented by Japanese people, and was every bit as good as places I've been in Japan, because I have been in Japan, I have family there. Served nopal cactus in something I had, and I thought, well, of course they did. They're delicious, and it worked, and it wasn't a compromise. It was because they saw that this is something that's delicious and fresh and would work. Mm-hmm.
Now, I'm getting hungry. I'm going to be able to get good huitlacoche at the Mercado Medellín, no?
Probably. It's not in season now. Huitlacoche is a corn fungus that tends to come in the rainy season, but you may find it because here in the city we get everything from everywhere. We're in the center of the country, and there are some areas of the country where there is rain or moisture, and you may see it. You do see things here. If you're in the countryside, for example, in the area of Guanajuato, you're not going to see huitlacoche or squash blossom flowers at this time of year at all. But here you may see it. You may or may not. Can't promise you.
Yet my fingers are crossed. I've been speaking here in Colonia, Roma, with Nicholas Gilman, who is the author of the blog and the book Good Food in Mexico City, Food Stalls, Fondas, and Fine Dining. Nick, thanks for taking the time.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks for having me on your program and with you.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. And special thanks to everybody who backed Season 3 on Kickstarter, including Paige Calvert, Jonathan Crow, Douglas Dollars, Paul Doyle, John French, Eric Graham, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Kimberly Hahn, Carl Haley, Stefan Halperin, Matt Howie, Andrew Hovenick, Mark Hines, Andy Cooney, Mark Larson, Matthew Lickey, Mr. Munverzi, Rob Motz, Lindsay Muniak, Daniel Murphy, Aidan Noman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Blake Riley, Rob Schultz, Cam Smith, Small Demons, Todd Shimoda, Kevin Smokler, Thomas Unterberger, Matt Warren, and Wayne Wright.